I filed a restraining order against my own father. 3 weeks later, he broke it at my daughter's school concert, walked down the side aisle of a 40-person hall until he was close enough that I could smell the drink on him, and reached past my shoulder for her anyway. 2 officers walked him out past every parent in that room while he shouted my name the whole way to the doors. I stood there holding my daughter against my chest, feeling her heartbeat against mine, and didn't say a single word back. My name's Ethan. I'm 36, married to Beth for 9 years, and until 2 years ago, if you'd asked me to describe my relationship with my dad, I'd have used words like complicated, maybe, or intense. The kind of soft language people reach for when they're not ready to use the harder, more accurate word underneath it. I want to tell you about the night I finally called the police on him, and the concert 3 weeks after that. But first, I need you to walk through the 2 years that came before both of those nights, because I've come to understand that nobody outside a family like mine ever believes how slowly and how deniably this kind of thing builds, right up until it doesn't. My dad's name is Gerald. He's 62, spent 31 years as a site manager for a construction firm in the Midlands before he retired early, 2 years ago, around the same time my mom finally left him after 34 years of marriage. I want to be careful here because I think it matters. My mom leaving wasn't the cause of what happened next. Not really. It was more like the thing that had been holding a particular door shut finally let go, and everything that had been building pressure behind it for decades came through all at once. My mom, for what it's worth, had been seeing a counselor privately for the better part of a year before she actually left. A woman named Frances Doyle who specialized, according to my mom, in what she called long marriage exit planning, which sounds almost clinical written down but was, I think, exactly the right kind of clinical for what my mom needed at the time. Someone to help her plan an exit from 34 years of a specific, learned role rather than someone to help her simply feel better about staying in it. My mom told me months later that Frances had said something to her early on that she'd carried with her ever since. That some people don't have tempers so much as they have outsourced regulation systems, entire households quietly organized around absorbing and softening a temper that was never actually being managed by the person who had it. I didn't understand what that meant fully until I watched my dad unmanaged for the first time in my adult life. I'd always known my dad had a temper. Growing up, it showed up in specific containable ways. A raised voice over a missed penalty in a football match, slammed cupboard doors when dinner was late, the kind of household weather you learn to read early and route around without ever quite naming it as something wrong. My mom was very good at managing that weather. I understand now, with some distance, that an enormous amount of her daily energy for 3 decades went into small, invisible adjustments designed to keep my dad calm. And that none of us, me, my sister Kate, even my dad himself, I suspect, ever had to reckon with what he was actually like without her doing that work in the background. When she left, that management simply stopped happening all at once, and what emerged from underneath it was something none of us had ever seen unmanaged before. The phone calls started within a few months of her leaving. I want to walk through this the way I actually lived it, because the pattern only became visible to me in hindsight, the same way it did with my mom's departure. Each call, taken on its own, looked like an understandable venting session from a man going through a hard divorce. Taken together over 18 months, they told a completely different story. The first real one I remember clearly was about 6 months after Mom left. I'd called to check in, an ordinary Sunday, and mentioned gently that Mom seemed to be doing okay, settling into a flat near Kate's place. My dad's voice changed almost instantly, climbing from flat to sharp in under a sentence, and he spent the next 20 minutes telling me I was choosing her side, that I'd always been closer to her, that nobody in this family had ever once considered how any of this looked from where he was standing. I remember getting off that call and sitting in my car in my own driveway for 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside, turning over the specific, uncomfortable feeling that I'd just been on the receiving end of something closer to an interrogation than a conversation. The second one, a few months later, was worse, and it's the one Kate ended up putting in writing for the court, months after the fact, because she'd been on the phone with me at the time and heard most of it through the speaker. My dad had called about something genuinely trivial, a query about whether I still had his old drill in my garage, and within minutes had pivoted, with a speed that still unsettles me to think about, into a furious monologue about how Mum had poisoned both me and Kate against him, how we'd chosen her narrative over his without ever once asking for his side, how he was going to end up alone because his own children had decided he was the villain of a story he hadn't even been allowed to tell. I tried, that time, to calmly point out that nobody had chosen anything, that I just wanted him to be all right, and he told me, in a tone I'd never heard from him before that year, that I was just like her and hung up on me. I sat with that phrase for a long time afterward. Just like her. I understood even then that it wasn't really about me at all. There was a third incident, smaller than the barbecue but earlier, that I think deserves its own mention, because it's the one that first made Beth start quietly changing her own behavior around my dad. Months before I fully caught up to what she'd already noticed. About 9 months after Mum left, My dad turned up at our house on a Saturday afternoon unannounced, which had started happening more often by then, and let himself into our back garden through the side gate, while Beth was out there alone with Lily, then 18 months old, in her paddling pool. He wasn't aggressive that day, not in the way he'd later become, but Beth told me afterward that he'd stood at the edge of the patio for a long moment before she'd even noticed him, watching them both without announcing himself, and that when she finally turned and saw him there, his first words weren't hello. They were a comment about how Mom had no right to be seeing another man yet. A rumor that turned out to have no basis at all, delivered to my wife unprompted, while she sat alone with our toddler in a paddling pool. Beth didn't tell me the full weight of how unsettling she'd found it until much later. Mostly, I think, because she was doing her own version of what I was doing, deciding again and again that this particular moment on its own wasn't quite bad enough to name as a real problem. She did start, from that day on, making sure she was never alone in the house with Lily when my dad was expected, a precaution I didn't fully register she'd built into her routine until she pointed it out to me herself. Once, months later, almost in passing. The barbecue happened about a year after Mom left. At my house, a small gathering for my birthday. Kate there with her 2 kids, a handful of old family friends. Kate had gone through her own divorce about 8 months earlier, and my dad, 3 or 4 beers into the afternoon, started needling her about it in front of everyone. Comments about how she should have tried harder, how modern marriages fell apart too easily, how in his day people worked through things instead of running. Kate went quiet the way she does when she's trying not to escalate something in public, and I stepped in, asked him, as evenly as I could manage, to leave it alone, that it wasn't the day for it. He turned on me fast, said I didn't get to tell him what he could and couldn't say to his own daughter, and when I said again calmly that I did if he was going to upset her at my own birthday, he shoved me hard, both hands flat against my chest, and I stumbled back into the edge of the garden table, hard enough to split my lip against my own teeth. The garden went silent the way rooms do when something crosses a line everyone's been quietly avoiding naming. Beth appeared at my side within seconds, one hand pressed to the side of my jaw, checking the cut. And my dad stood there for a moment with an expression I can only describe as somewhere between shock and defiance, like he was as surprised by what he'd just done as anyone else. But not sorry enough to say so. I gave him chances after that. I want to be honest about how long and how generously, because I think it matters to what came next. I told myself for months that grief made people act like strangers sometimes, that a man losing a 34-year marriage was allowed some latitude I wouldn't extend to anyone else, that cutting him off entirely felt like a betrayal of whatever version of him I still remembered from before any of this started. I saw him at Christmas, tense but without incident. I let him back into the house for a few ordinary Sunday visits, careful ones, always with Beth present, always with an exit plan I never fully admitted to myself I was making. I kept hoping the version of him from before Mom left would resurface if I just gave the current version enough time and enough patience to burn itself out. It didn't burn out. It got worse, and it got worse specifically in the direction of my house, my wife, and my daughter, which is the part I think I was slowest to fully let myself see, because some part of me still wanted to believe his anger was really about my mom and would eventually exhaust itself, somewhere that didn't touch the family I'd built separately from the one I grew up. In the night that changed everything was a Tuesday, 11 at night back in October. Lily was asleep. Beth and I were watching something forgettable on the sofa when the banging started at the front door, hard enough that I felt it through the floor before I consciously registered what it was. My dad's voice came through before I'd even reached the hallway, already at full volume, shouting that I'd turned my mum against him, that I owed him an explanation, that he wasn't leaving until I gave him one. I opened the door. I've asked myself many times since whether that was the right call, and I still don't fully know, and found him swaying slightly on the step, coat half-buttoned, eyes red in a way that told me this wasn't his first drink of the evening by a long way. I told him to go home, that it was 11 at night, that Lily was asleep upstairs. He kept shouting, the same accusation on a loop, turned me against him, poisoned everything, and Beth appeared behind me in the hallway with Lily on her hip. She'd woken at the noise, 3 years old, confused. One small fist pressed against her own eye, and I remember the exact moment my dad's voice registered that Lily was there and, instead of lowering, got louder, more performative, aimed now at an audience rather than just at me. I stepped fully into the doorway, blocking his view of both of them, and told him, as flatly as I could manage over the sound of my own pulse in my ears, that if he didn't leave in the next 30 seconds, I was calling the police. He laughed at that. He said I wouldn't. He was wrong. 2 officers arrived 12 minutes later, spoke to him at length on the pavement outside my house, and eventually persuaded him into a taxi rather than arresting him that night. Largely, I think, because it was his first documented incident with the police directly. Whatever history existed before that, living only in raised voices and a split lip, nobody had ever formally reported. I remember standing in my hallway afterward with Beth, Lily finally back asleep against her shoulder, and Beth saying very quietly that this couldn't keep happening, that she wasn't willing to raise our daughter around the possibility of a night like that, one recurring at any interval at all. I filed for the restraining order the following week, with Beth's full support, and frankly at her insistence more than my own initial instinct. Some part of me was still operating on decades of old habit, still hoping there was a version of this where I could manage my dad's temper the way my mum used to, rather than formally asking the state to manage it instead. The order was comprehensive. No contact, no approaching my house, my workplace, or Lily's school. The hearing itself lasted almost 2 hours, longer than either Beth or I had expected going in, presided over by a woman I'll simply describe as measured and unhurried, District Judge Allison Marchetti, who I later learned had sat on family and civil protection matters in that court for 9 years. Our solicitor, a family law specialist named Priya Nair, coincidentally the third Priya to cross paths with this family in as many years, though no relation to anyone else involved, had prepared a timeline exhibit laying out the pattern month by month rather than incident by incident, which Judge Marchetti specifically commented on partway through, saying that timelines organized this way, showing frequency and escalation over a defined period, were considerably more persuasive to her than a handful of isolated incidents presented without any sense of trajectory. She heard, in order, the paddling pool incident, which Beth gave evidence about herself, visibly nervous but steady, the interrogation-style phone call, corroborated by Kate's written statement, the flat incident where my dad had refused to leave Kate's home for over an hour despite repeated requests, also in Kate's statement, and the barbecue shove, supported by 2 independent witnesses from that afternoon who'd agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to put their accounts in writing once they understood how the pattern as a whole was being presented to the court. Judge Marchetti granted the order in full, noting in her summary, which I've read more times than I probably should since, that the pattern showed consistent and escalating disregard for boundaries explicitly communicated by multiple family members over an extended period, language that struck me, reading it afterward, as a far more precise description of the previous 2 years than anything I'd managed to put into words myself in all that time. My dad left me a voicemail 2 days after the order was served. I still have it saved, and I've listened to it more times than I probably should admit, mostly trying to work out whether the version of him on that recording believed what he was saying. He called it a betrayal. He said I'd made him a criminal for losing his temper twice, which I noted, even in the moment, was itself a significant understatement of what the court had actually heard evidence of. He said he hoped I was proud of myself. He didn't mention Lily once in the entire 2.5 minutes, which I've come to think is its own kind of telling detail, given what happened 3 weeks later. I should say something here about what happened in that 3-week gap, because it wasn't silent the way I expected it to be, and I think the shape of it matters to understanding the concert itself. My dad called Kate 4 times in that stretch, each call, according to what she told me afterward, opening with some version of an appeal to family loyalty and escalating, by the end, into the same accusations he'd leveled at me, that Mum had turned us all against him, that the order was a public humiliation designed to make him look dangerous to strangers, that Kate, of all people, should understand what it felt like to be judged unfairly after her own divorce. Kate told him on the 3rd of those calls that she'd testified in writing about the flat incident specifically because it had actually happened, and she wasn't willing to pretend otherwise to make him feel better, and that if he wanted his relationship with either of us to have any future at all, the only path back ran through actually respecting the order rather than lobbying her to see it as unfair. He called her a 4th time anyway, 2 days before the concert, and left a message she also kept saying, and this is the detail that mattered most, in hindsight, that no piece of paper was going to stop him from being a grandfather to that little girl. Kate texted me the transcript of that voicemail the same evening she received it, worried, in her words, that he actually means this literally. And I remember reading it, standing in my kitchen and feeling something cold settle in my chest that I didn't fully understand until 3 weeks later, watching him walk down that side aisle toward my daughter using almost exactly the same words. I should say something about how the wider family reacted in that same 3-week window, because it wasn't only Kate and my dad's calls that shaped what happened next, and I think leaving that part out would make the concert seem more sudden than it actually was. My dad has a younger brother, my uncle Raymond, who lives about 2 hours away and had, up to that point, stayed almost entirely outside the whole situation, the way some family members do, not out of malice but out of a kind of long-practiced neutrality that treats staying uninvolved as its own form of keeping the peace. Raymond called me directly about 10 days after the order was granted, the first time we'd spoken one-to-one in probably 2 years, and told me my dad had been ringing him almost nightly, sometimes twice in an evening, delivering variations of the same monologue he'd been giving Kate, that Mum had engineered all of it, that I was punishing him disproportionately for a couple of bad moments, that his own family had turned into strangers overnight for reasons he still couldn't fully explain to himself. Raymond told me, carefully, that he wasn't calling to take sides, but that he'd started to notice something in these calls that worried him more than the anger itself. My dad, according to Raymond, kept circling back to one specific idea, repeated almost word for word each time that seeing that little girl again would somehow prove to everyone that none of this was as serious as we were all making it out to be. I thanked Raymond for telling me, and I remember sitting with that phone call for a long time afterward, turning over the specific, deliberate shape of that idea, not a slip of anger, but a plan forming, however informally, around a specific goal. My dad's old employer factored into this window too, in a way I only found out about afterward. He'd stayed on with the same construction firm in a part-time consulting capacity even after his formal retirement, largely, I think, for the routine and the company as much as the money. And one of his former colleagues, a site foreman named Barry Coulthard, who'd worked under my dad for close to 15 years, mentioned to Kate at a chance meeting in town that my dad had been telling people at the firm's retirement social a version of events in which he'd been cut off from his own granddaughter over a misunderstanding, with no mention at all of the order, the barbecue, or anything approaching the actual sequence of events. Kate told me this the same week Raymond called, and between the two of them, I remember feeling something settle into place that I hadn't fully let myself see until then. My dad wasn't simply struggling to process what had happened. He was actively constructing a version of it for an audience, in which the order itself was the injustice, and he was the one being wronged, and I understood. Watching that version spread quietly through people who had no way of checking it against the actual court record, that some kind of confrontation with the real facts was probably coming, one way or another, whether or not it happened anywhere near my daughter. The concert was on a Thursday evening. Lily's school hall, maybe 40 parents on folding chairs packed close enough together that getting up required an apology to your neighbor on either side. I was near the front with my phone up, filming her class sing the first of their 4 songs, Beth beside me, when I felt the room shift slightly behind me. That specific, hard-to-describe awareness you get sometimes of someone entering a space who wasn't supposed to be there, a change in the room's temperature before you've consciously placed why. I turned and saw him standing at the back doors, scanning the rows of parents until he found us, and then starting down the side aisle with the unhurried, entitled pace of someone who genuinely believed he had every right to be walking it. I was on my feet before I'd finished processing that it was actually him. I told him, loud enough for him to hear over the singing, but low enough, I hoped, not to alarm the whole room immediately, that he needed to leave, that this violated the order and he knew it. He said he just wanted to see his granddaughter sing, that no piece of paper was going to stop him from being a grandfather, the exact phrase from Kate's voicemail, and kept moving closer despite 2 parents near the aisle, glancing over with a specific uncertain look of people who've just noticed something is wrong but haven't worked out what yet. Beth grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her back a step, putting a folding chair between them and the aisle, and I planted myself directly between my dad and my family, close enough now that I could smell the drink on him, sharp and unmistakable even under the noise of 40 children singing This Little Light of Mine behind us with no idea anything was wrong. Stop right there, I said. Every step closer is another violation I'm reporting in the same breath. He said I was embarrassing him in front of strangers. He said I'd always looked for reasons to keep him from his own grandchild, going back years, an accusation with no actual history behind it that I could identify. And then he reached past my shoulder toward Lily anyway, and I caught his wrist midair and pushed his arm back down harder than I meant to. Hard enough that a teacher standing near the side wall finally started moving toward us at speed. This is exactly why the order exists, I told him. Reaching for her without asking is precisely the behavior it was written to stop. He said he was her grandfather. He said blood meant something a judge could never understand. I told him blood hadn't stopped him from putting his hands on me at my own birthday barbecue either, so I wasn't especially interested in what it was supposed to guarantee him now, and I watched something in his face flinch at that, fast, like I'd said something he genuinely hadn't expected to hear back. A few parents nearby had started quietly herding their own kids further toward the back of the hall by then, that same careful, wordless choreography of people who've decided something is happening that their children shouldn't be near the middle of. My dad's voice climbed louder, said I was making a scene out of nothing, that he'd driven 40 minutes just to hear his granddaughter sing 4 songs, and I told him as steadily as I could manage with my own pulse hammering in my ears that none of that mattered, not after a judge had already decided exactly what he was and wasn't allowed to do. The school's head, a woman named Denise Ashcroft, who I later learned had been in post for 11 years, had already stepped out to call the police by the time the teacher reached us. And I kept my dad talking, kept him at arm's length, kept my body angled between him and my family the entire time, watching his face cycle between wounded and furious and back again in a way that felt, even in the moment, less like a man overcome by love for his granddaughter, and more like a man testing exactly how far a room full of strangers would let him go before someone stopped him. 2 officers arrived within 8 minutes. I know it was 8 because, exactly like the day at the party 3 weeks earlier, I found myself watching the clock on the wall of that hall almost the entire time, unable to stop counting. They walked him out past all 40 parents, most of whom had stopped even pretending not to watch by then, and he shouted my name the whole way to the double doors at the back. Ethan, Ethan, you're destroying this family over nothing. And I stood there in the middle of that hall, Lily now lifted up against my chest, her small heartbeat fast and uneven against mine, and I didn't respond to him once, not a single word, all the way until the doors swung shut behind him. He was arrested that night, a few streets from the school, for breach of the order, his second recorded offense, which I've since learned carries meaningfully more weight in how the courts, and, eventually, any future proceedings treat a person's pattern of conduct, no longer an isolated lapse the first time, but an established, repeated choice. I want to tell you what happened in the days after that, because I think it matters as much as the concert itself. Kate called me the next morning, first thing, and said she was sorry, that she should have believed how bad things had actually gotten months before she finally put anything in writing for the court. She told me she'd spent a long time telling herself the flat incident had been a one-off, an unusually bad night rather than a pattern. The same story I'd been telling myself about the phone calls for the better part of 2 years. And that watching him walk down that aisle at Lily's concert had finally made it impossible for her to keep believing that version. I told her I understood completely, because I'd done the exact same thing to myself for a lot longer than she had. Raymond called again too, 4 days after the concert, and this time there was no careful neutrality left in his voice at all. He told me he'd finally said something directly to my dad, the first time in their entire lives as brothers that he could remember doing so, telling him plainly that showing up at a primary school concert in breach of a court order wasn't a grandfather asserting his rights. It was a man escalating a pattern that had already put his own son in front of a judge once, and was now putting him in handcuffs in front of 40 families with young children. Raymond said my dad had gone quiet on the phone for a long stretch after that, the longest silence he could remember from him in years, and had eventually said only that he hadn't thought about it that way, which Raymond wasn't sure whether to read as the beginning of something honest or simply the sound of a man temporarily out of arguments. I told Raymond I understood that uncertainty completely, because I'd spent 2 years unable to tell the difference myself. The Barry Coulthard version of events, the one my dad had apparently been telling at his old firm's retirement social, stopped circulating almost entirely once word of the concert got back to that same social circle, which Kate heard about through a mutual acquaintance. A couple of weeks later, people who'd previously taken my dad's account of a misunderstanding at face value apparently found it much harder to keep extending him that benefit of the doubt once the story became a man arrested at a children's concert for breaching a protection order, rather than a vague family disagreement recounted secondhand at a retirement due. I didn't take any particular satisfaction in that shift, if I'm honest. It just confirmed something I'd already come to understand on my own, that a story like the one he'd been telling only survives in rooms where nobody has access to the actual sequence of events, and collapses the moment it meets anyone who does. My mom called too, 3 days later, the first time we'd spoken about any of this directly rather than through Kate. She didn't defend him, which I think I'd half-braced myself for out of old habit. 34 years of watching her manage his temper rather than name it. Instead, she said something that stayed with me since, that she'd spent decades absorbing the version of him that showed up before it reached anyone else, and that some part of her had assumed, without ever consciously deciding it, that leaving would mean the rest of us simply inherited a calmer man than the one she'd been managing. I think I owe you an apology for that, she said, even though I couldn't have known. I gave you all the version of him I'd spent 30 years keeping contained, and then I stopped containing it, and none of us were ready for what that actually looked like without me standing in front of it. Beth hasn't let go of my hand, in any meaningful sense, since that night in the school hall. Not literally every second, obviously, but there's been a different quality to how she reaches for it. More frequent, more deliberate in the days since. And I understand it as its own kind of aftermath, a small, constant checking that we're both still standing where we're supposed to be standing. Lily asked me the next morning, over breakfast, in the direct, uncomplicated way 3-year-olds ask enormous questions, whether Grandpa was in trouble. I told her he needed time to learn how to follow rules, and I left it there because I think that's the truest, simplest version of the situation I could give her without either frightening her or pretending things were smaller than they actually were. I don't know what happens next with my dad. I know there's a further hearing scheduled. Given the second breach, and I know, from the little Kate's told me since, that he's still framing all of this to anyone who will listen as a family, turning against him rather than a pattern finally catching up with him. I've stopped waiting for him to describe it any other way. I spent 2 years hoping the man from before my mom left would resurface if I just gave the current version enough patience to wear itself out. And I understand now that patience was never going to be the thing that changed anything. Because patience only works on people who are also doing their own share of the work in the meantime, and he never once was. I think about the paddling pool a lot, actually. more than I expected to when Beth first told me the full story of that afternoon, months after it happened. I think about her sitting there with Lily, 18 months old, entirely unaware that anything was wrong, while my dad stood at the edge of our patio deciding, on his own, that he had the right to let himself into that private moment, uninvited, and comment on my mother's imagined new relationship before he'd even said hello. I think about how long it took any of us, Beth, me, eventually Kate, to stop treating each of these moments as isolated weather and start treating them as a single, continuous system. The same outsourced regulation system Frances Doyle had apparently tried to describe to my mum months before she finally left it behind. I understand now that the entire 2 years between my mum's departure and that school hall was really just the slow process of that system finally running without anyone left to manage it, and of the rest of us gradually, reluctantly, working out that someone else was going to have to. What I know for certain is this. I stood between my father and my daughter in a school hall full of strangers, and I'd do it again in exactly the same way, without hesitation, as many times as it takes. Some kinds of love come with conditions attached, whether or not the person on the other end of them is willing to hear that yet. Mine does now. His apparently still doesn't, and until it does, there's a piece of paper standing between him and my family that I intend to make sure keeps its full weight, no matter how many voicemails he leaves calling it a betrayal, no matter how many versions of the story he tells at retirement socials 2 counties away, no matter how many brothers he calls late at night trying to find one person left who'll agree with him that none of this was ever really his fault. Lily's next school concert is in the summer term. Beth's already asked me, half joking and half not, whether we should tell the school in advance this time, just in case. I told her yes. I don't think either of us are going to take that particular risk lightly again, and I've come to understand that this, too, is simply part of what the order is actually for, not just a document that exists somewhere in a file, but a standing, ongoing decision, renewed every single time it's tested, about exactly whose comfort we're still willing to prioritize and whose we're not.